I have a feeling I'm going to get a lot of arguments with this because it goes counter to just about what every TV documentary, book, and college course has to say. And that is that Hollywood has gone through the pattern of getting woke, that is, chasing a fringe minority of ultra communist, socialist, social justice warrior students, even if they weren't calling themselves that at the time, who are mostly in college or mostly just out of college, who feel entitled to see everything that the previous generation valued destroyed before their eyes. And because they make a lot of noise, gaslighting Hollywood into believing that there are a lot more of them out there than there actually are. And when Hollywood chases this small, tiny fringe of the general population, they go broke and pretty much destroy themselves and have to wait for a new generation of filmmakers to rediscover traditional filmmaking and and tr- and traditional values for the films that they are putting out, and that eventually saves them. The fact is, get woke, go broke is not a new phenomenon because it happened before in the 1960s. In fact, modern day corporate Hollywood wouldn't have happened if Hollywood hadn't stupidly chased an audience that didn't exist in the 1960s and 70s, and it was finally saved by new young filmmakers such as Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, who ironically went on to become producers of some of the liberal films that are destroying Hollywood now, had brought back the traditional sort of family adventure films that they remembered enjoying in their youth. Yeah. So yeah, and I know this runs counter to everything you've ever heard about the 1960s. According to every documentary I've ever seen, every book I've ever read about the 1960s, everyone everyone below age like 35 was a long-haired hippie who who hated America, who hated traditional values, who hated their families, who just wanted who 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 if you released a traditional movie, you were doomed you because they wanted to see pot smoking, um, sex everywhere. Um, they wanted to see things like of stage play with traditional values, such as Paint Your Wagon, which was already diverse for its time, but they because it involved a love story between a Mexican prospector and an American girl. But for the Hollywood version, they decided the way to make it more diverse was to have two bisexual male leads sharing a wife in a menage a trois and get the film the equivalent of an M rating. Now, according to everything I've ever heard, that was the popular pulse of the nation. And when they compare what's going on today to the 1960s, they say, see, this is history repeating itself. We're changing the world just like we did in the 1960s. Except that didn't happen. I am as I've done more research looking into what the popular trends actually were in the 60s, I've been forced to conclude that just like today, this was a fringe, tiny minority, and that when you catered to them, it fell apart. And not only that, but we had a whole TV show in the 1980s that was a family sitcom, and it was all about how once these kids grew up, these this fringe minority of kids that were the social justice warriors of their time grew up, it they became the Republicans who kept Republicans in power throughout the entire decade of the 1980s and push for very traditional entertainment. And so it was a phase. It wasn't a world-changing event, and it certainly wasn't the pulse of a nation. But a lot of Hollywood filmmakers and stars, because these groups were out there throwing things and, you know, burning stuff and locking themselves in, they it was just like Twitter. Before Twitter, you had the protests on TV. Well, what the protests didn't show was that it was the same thing as Twitter. It was like the same 10,000 people or so showing up to all of these, and thus everybody thought oh, it's 10,000 different people each time. No, no, it was usually the same few cities with the same few thousand college students coming out to these things. And the only reason we continue to believe that they were popular and everybody else was losing ground is because they went on to become the college professors and documentary filmmakers who wrote the history. That's it. But they were really a fringe minority who were trying to pretend. And I do have some proof to look at this. Because according to them, a movie like Paint Your Wagon, released at the height of this movement and the backlash where everybody saw traditional values as old fashioned and everybody hated, yeah, everybody saw how empty they were and were fighting back against the corrupt, traditional conservative Christian values in America. Well, that should have gone over extremely well. Instead, it was one of the biggest money losers of the decade. Then you have the general drop off. The movie industry started off healthy, and then towards the middle of the decade, as it kept chasing this trend, it it went bankrupt. Studio after studio went bankrupt and got bought out by larger corporations. Paramount Pictures was the first, being bought by Gulf Western, a company known for making car parts and aftershave, for crying out loud. But the but the but here are some numbers for what happened to the film industry during the 60s. It started out strong with around 40 million people a week going to see movies every single week. They had an average theater attendance of 40 million people around the country going to see movies every week. That was and this was after the scare. I know some people try to confuse the numbers and say that TV was in the middle was killing theaters in the 1960s. No, that scare was long gone. There had been a massive drop off in the middle of the 1950s, carrying on into as late as 1958. But as you see, movie theater attendance drastically recovered in the early 60s, especially with the debut of so-called roadhouse picture, where they where these were ultra widescreen color, and they were and these movies tended to be around between 2.5 and 3.5 hours long too, and they had an intermission built in, and they made going to the movies a special event again. But that wasn't the only thing going for it. But yeah, the but movies recovered only to in the middle of the decade start dropping off again, and by the end of the decade, only an average of 17.5 million people were going to the movies every week. That is more than a 50% decline in the number of people going to movies. And this was right in the period where, if you look for your movie catalog, studios came out hard trying to target the rebellious college audiences. And some of these movies and some of those movies did do well, but they did well in that they didn't cost much to make. So, yeah, but it's like but to say they weren't really the highest grossing movies of the decade. I mean, there are exceptions, but by and large, it was still family fare that ruled the box office and kept Hollywood. The movies that ruled the decade were the standout ones that defied the trend. And I mean, you have the top grossing movie of the decade was The Sound of Music. Then the second highest grossing one with $158 million. Then you had The Jungle Book, 137 million. The Graduate was a rebellious film, so you have that. So they weren't a complete call. They weren't a complete for they weren't a complete failure of attempts to target the woke college students, but they weren't the biggest things ever that as it's often portrayed, and they weren't enough to offset the fact that the studios were in trouble. That and more often than not they failed. You know, Bush Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, My Fair Lady, Thunderball. The James Bond movies were considered escapist entertainment. Cleopatra grossed 57 million, but because of its 6 year protracted production, I've covered this before, it did not make money. 2001: The Space Odyssey, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which the liberal Democrats, it's funny, they've tried to claim 1960s, race mixing was their thing, but it wasn't. They were the ones filibustering the civil rights bill. They were the ones firebombing buses with freedom riders. It was actually conservative Republicans who were demanding that there be police protection given to freedom riders and that were joining freedom riders on buses. Not it was the South they portray it now because the South votes Republican and they think people are stupid and that they'll know what and that they'll know and that they won't know that things change. But the South in the 1960s was the hardcore belt of the Democrats and liberals, and it was very much what kept Democratic liberals in power. And yeah, so you have Funny Girl, Goldfinger, The Love Bug. Yeah, number 12 is The Love Bug. You have another rebellious movie, Bonnie and Clyde, Midnight Cowboy, and going down there. So again, they weren't total failures. So you can see, but the fact that Hollywood tends to do this thing where if they see something that appeals to a certain segment of youth market, they think we have to go in on that. We can't have older audiences. We need young audiences, but they don't realize that it's not even all the young people. And that's what I'm seeing here. It's a Mad World, The Odd Couple, West Side Story, Lawrence of Arabia, Psycho. Pretty much most of these movies have traditional morality. I mean, even Psycho is like, well, she stole money from her employer, and that's gonna haunt her till the day she dies. And yeah, it's very much that. Then you have TV, which, yeah, if you look, you can't really see a single show anywhere in the top 20 of the decade that wasn't family. And this wasn't just due to censorship, because there were definitely shows that tried to get on this trend, but they couldn't get traction. And so, yeah, Hollywood pursue. So, yeah, if anyone's worried about whether or not Hollywood will survive this, it will. Here's the thing. Any, it's just that this is a trend that Hollywood has done before. It happens. I guess it happens. I guess it happens every 50 years or so. Hollywood, there's a fringe group acting up, making a lot of noise on whatever the public forum is, and they know how to get attention on that public forum. Right now, the social justice warriors know how to get attention on Twitter. Back then, they knew how to get attention on television. But if you look at what's actually making money, it's go it's it's completely different things. And somebody will realize that, and the tide will start to turn. The tide start And here's the thing. The tide started to turn, and I would give Jaws some of the credit for this because it took a book that wasn't very family friendly and turned it into a sort of family adventure film. I know people talk about that as a horror movie, but it was marketed sort of as that. It was marketed as that, but it really comes off more of as a sort of family adventure film since Spielberg cut out all the subplots that made the main characters in this less than ideal heroes. He basically turned the characters from the novel into much more traditional heroes. I mean, Quint, for all his faults, his toughness and thing against Shark comes from him being on the Indianapolis. He has a backstory for that. They got rid of subplots involving affairs and and darker stuff about Brody's character, and it was Hooper no longer had an affair with Brody's wife, and yes, it cut down on rent, but it made it much more family friendly, and its huge returns prove that the family audience was where it was at, and then Star Wars 2 years later reaffirmed that, and that's how you got into the 1980s with its with where you had where your heroes became much more traditional heroes. You also had Superman come out a year after Star Wars that proved again that people wanted traditional heroes, and Hollywood learned, and these Hollywood studios that have been staving off bankruptcy just barely for about a decade suddenly realized, oh, this is where the money is, and they turned around. And I think we've reached that point. I think 2022 is going to be seen as one of those turning points because we have a similar situation to the 1960s right now. Everything is down. The only thing keeping them afloat is the fact that they keep jacking up the prices for their services. But that can't continue forever, especially with the economy going down the toilet. That again happened in the 70s, and it affected movies. In the 1960s, throughout the 60s, the average price of a movie ticket went up from 67 cents to $1.42. Now look, now that's more than double. Look at that's almost double. Now look at now look at them Now look at the studios jacking up the prices of their streaming services. Again, just like the movie tickets, this is a panic move because they don't know what to do. But I think they're starting to see the light. With films like Top Gun Maverick coming out and blowing away the woke competition. And believe me, this is a phenomenon like I've never seen before. I mean, I went to see Top Gun Maverick for my birthday, and I wasn't even really a fan of the original. And um, it was great. The theater was packed there. Well, I just went back to see it 2 days 2 days ago. No, 3 days ago, and the theater was still 3/4 full with families and people who apparently hadn't seen the movie yet. I mean, the nearest person sitting to me was like this boy who looked like he was 8. He had his MCU Spider-Man shirt on, and according to the according to the you know popular according to popular common sense, quote unquote, the only way to entertain a kid of his generation is to have an MCU movie that is all jokes, it's all CGI, and all this stuff. But he was hooked. Everyone in the theater was still hooked, and I haven't seen a movie keep bring in a family audience like this. I mean, I know No Way Home and Endgame brought in a lot of people, but when I went back to see them a second time, it was all people my age. It was all hardcore comic book fans, that sort of thing. This wasn't that. This was families coming back to enjoy it, and that's what's made it one of the top 10 domestic movies of all time. I think it's at number 7 right now. And so, and and it's like there were grandparents in the audience who were getting entertained by this, and there was this kid who, when it looked like Maverick had died, he was like, "What?" His mom literally, his reaction was so loud that his mother literally had to shh him. And you have, and so yeah, but it's not just that alone. We're seeing on streaming, not the non woke shows and movies. They're the ones pulling in the big streaming numbers now. Disney Plus, with its doubling down on everything woke for the MCU, is doing pathetic. They have shows now, MCU shows, that have fewer viewers than shows on the CW. And let me remind you, the CW is a network that went all in on the woke agenda, and now it's being given away. Its parent company literally decided to give an entire television network away to another company. I have never heard of that happening before. That's how low their ratings were. And so, yeah, and they're free. So, and what's more, the MCU is the biggest thing out there. So you would think, and what's more, you have to watch these shows in order to get the movies. But even the movies, none of them have bombed yet. I want to be clear on that. A lot of people are saying this bomb, that bomb. No, none of them have bombed yet. They've all made a profit, but it's diminishing returns. Every MCU film is now making a little less than the film that came after it. So uh, it's probably going to take like 4 or 5 years, but eventually you will have the first MCU film that does not make back its production and advertising budget, because budgets are going up while returns are going down little by little. It's going to take a while to wear people down from their addiction to this, but it is happening. And I'm seeing more and more people, and more and more people seem to be speaking out. Look at Warner Brothers canceling the new CEO, David Zaslav, canceling projects left and right. The only reason the Flash hasn't been canceled, I think, is because there is some sort of complex distribution deal in place for that, and Warner Brothers will get sued if they don't release that. So they're trying to figure out, can we release this without taking too bad a hit, or do we risk the lawsuits? I think they're in a rock and a hard place with that one, but everything else is getting canceled, and for good reason. Because, and here's the thing: even without the woke agenda, even without it failing, you have to ask yourself, why wouldn't the new executives cancel everything coming in? No, nothing the previous team has done has made money since, well, I think Shazam was the last DC movie that made money. But anyway, so why would they keep it? Because all these projects, they weren't going to be finished until 2025, 2026. Why would they wait 4 or 5 years to put their own ideas into motion? But yeah, I guess I got off on tangents there. My point is that we have seen this before. Everybody thinks this is the end of everything. No, what will happen is the studios that course correct and make more films like Top Gun Maverick, as both Paramount and Warner Brothers seem to be committing to, with Paramount saying they're not going to censor movies on their service, and and you know and Warner Brothers seemingly canceling the old stuff, and the new CEO saying that he wants to build an build a cinematic universe based on the traditional versions of Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, not these new takes on the characters. I think we're gonna see. I think we're gonna see major change in the future, and that's a good thing. I think we've reached 1975. We're not totally out of the woods yet when it comes to Hollywood making movies about how much they hate us, how much they hate white people, and making preachy garbage, talking about and all and all this stuff. But I think in a few years we could be, because we've seen the first proof of concept in Top Gun Maverick, and there are other films that aren't woke that are also doing surprisingly well. Compare and somebody and there are going to be people at these studios looking at this and going, okay, profit trends are up for these types of movies and they're going down for these ones. It'll take a while, but because they have to under because they have to have the courage to just stand, because it has to get so bad that they're willing to stand up to BlackRock and its stupid social credit system that means nothing when it comes to whether or not a business is a good investment. But BlackRock controls so much of the world's so much of the stock market right now that they have this stupid social credit system. But to their credit, Paramount has said, screw the social credit system. Yeah, they've told BlackRock to go screw themselves, and I think David Zaslav at Warner Brothers is doing the same thing, because both of those studios have gotten to the point where they've lost so much money that it's either pivot to profit or die. Now, it's gonna take a while for somebody like Disney to get there, so don't expect. So it's gonna be at least a decade before you see your favorite Marvel characters get saved from this. But I think it will happen because it's happened before. It's just a historical pattern. And every time one group makes a lot of noise, they scare the old guys in suits, because the people who have the energy to make a lot of noise tend to be unemployed young people, or people with a part-time job. So old people look at that and they go, "That's the future." But it's not. And they're learning that again. It's just that they had to learn the same lesson they did in the 1960s and throughout the 70s, when they pivoted back to being profitable operations. It's happened before, it will happen again. So, those are just my thoughts on the get woke go broke trend, just based on some stuff I was reading about the 1960s, and I suddenly just saw this is exactly what's happening now. And it's like, yeah, this is ending. We, the, I, that's why they're trying to take down Maverick, I think, because it's showed what the future is. It's shown that the game is over, and it's shown the studios that have to make money, that don't have theme parks or other things to fall back on, that they can either go with BlackRock's social credit score system, or they can call BlackRock's bluff and say, fine, sell off our stock. Mark us as a not buy, as a don't buy for our social experiments, and see if that hurts us long term. We'll take the short term hit from you, but long term, investors who are desperate, who will be desperate for good investments as this stock market tanks, and will be desperate to put their money into profitable companies, that will be the long term. And long term, we win. We That's it. The people who just want entertainment win. The people who want a preachy social justice message lose. They've lost in the past, they're losing now, and that's why they're lashing out. This video went on a lot longer than I thought it would. I'm sorry, but I just felt like there was something I wanted to share. Alright, so thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.